Inaugurations aren't just pomp and circumstance. Sometimes the circumstances are really awkward. When you put two people together who spent months or years publicly savaging each other, it's a recipe for bad behavior. Okay, let's start with the obvious one in 2017. When you elect someone who sells himself as non-traditional, you should probably expect a non-traditional inauguration. In this case, Donald Trump exceeded all expectations. On their first day, most presidents choose to address the country with optimism and a spirit of unity. Trump wanted to scare everyone to death. Titled American Carnage, Trump's speech was super dark, even apocalyptic, painting a picture of a country on the verge of falling apart.
This American carnage stops right here and stops right now.
Several former occupants of the White House on both sides of the political spectrum later said they couldn't believe what they were hearing.
And George W. Bush says to me, well, that was some weird shit.
Wow.
That wasn't the only bizarre thing about Trump's inauguration. The whole transition was unusual and awkward, largely due to a lot of overconfidence on one side of the aisle.
Well, at real Donald Trump, at least I will go down as a president.
It was also weird because the Trumps were pretty much new to politics and brought their own approach to just about everything. For example, when the Obamas formally welcomed the Trumps to the White House for the first time, Melania handed Michelle a wrapped gift, as if she was coming over for a dinner party. According to Michelle, she was so surprised by the present that she didn't know what to do with it until her husband tactfully stepped in and took it inside. The box contained an empty Tiffany's picture frame.
It's a metaphor, see?
Let's go with that. There were a few big issues with JFK's inauguration that are often forgotten today. First, the vice president made an awkward mistake while taking his oath of office. The oath was administered by Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn, who asked Lyndon B. Johnson to repeat after him, saying, "I take this obligation without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion." Johnson, however, replied, "I take this obligation without any mental reservation, whatever." So, ironically, he literally evaded the purpose of evasion part. You'd think an oath would have to be something you'd get exactly right, but apparently no one really cared. Significantly worse things happened during this inauguration anyway. As Cardinal Richard Cushing was giving his invocation speech during the ceremony, the podium he was speaking at caught fire. It was due to an electrical short, and the Secret Service had to rush in to take care of it. This was an issue with the weather, which commonly causes problems during inaugurations. After all, it's January on the East Coast. In this case, a faulty heater had been set up behind the podium to keep the speakers warm. Also weather-related, well, technically double weather-related, the poet Robert Frost was unable to read the poem he intended to. Like, he literally couldn't read it due to the glare of the sun off the 8 inches of snow that had fallen the night before. But few people talk about all this today because JFK's inauguration and his inauguration speech was such a momentous event in American history. For many, JFK represented youth, hope, and optimism. His inauguration speech still stands as one of the best ever written and included what is arguably JFK's most memorable line.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
And for those keeping score at home, Kennedy's unforgettable speech was a mere 14 minutes compared to the life-changing 2 hours this next guy took. An editor is a beautiful thing, and if William Henry Harrison had used one when writing his inauguration speech, his presidency, and the rest of his life might have been very different. We'll never know. What we do know is that the 68-year-old Harrison's 8,445-word speech droned on for just under 2 excruciating hours. To this date, it is the longest inauguration speech by far in American history. Not only was Harrison's speech a rambling snooze fest about the political process, he also delivered it in the chilling cold, for which he was severely underdressed.
He was like, listen, I'm not going to wear a coat to my inauguration because I need to show the American people I'm a strong dude.
31 days after taking office, Harrison didn't look like a strong dude. He actually looked super dead, thanks to a fatal case of pneumonia. His was the shortest presidency in US history.
Maybe I should have worn a coat.
We know, technically speaking, he didn't get pneumonia from giving the speech, but being 68 and standing outside for 2 hours speaking isn't exactly a way to not get sick. Incoming President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the outgoing guy Herbert Hoover spent the majority of Roosevelt's inauguration in stony silence, having fought each other to the point of withering contempt over Roosevelt's New Deal proposals.
Change in party leadership does not strike at the fundamental principles of the Republic.
Hoover had called Roosevelt a chameleon on plaid, a scathing indictment that we have to assume made a lot more sense in 1932.
Roosevelt would enter a room with one set of ideas, and then he would find the people in the room had another set of ideas, and he would adjust.
Still, FDR had the last laugh. He was elected president 4 times, his death in office was mourned across the world, and he's made heroic cameo appearances in everything from cartoons to the stage musical Annie, a play in which Herbert Hoover is also immortalized by a bunch of unhoused Hoovervillites who count him as the reason they live under a bridge. In some ways, George Washington's inauguration went better than many that came later. For one, he got 100% of the electoral votes, so there weren't many fake smiles in the crowd. Unless, of course, you count Washington himself.
Well, General, you are here. I am.
According to those who were there, our first president was the furthest thing from smooth that day. During the ceremony, he was anxious, embarrassed, and agitated. Not only was he shaking, but he delivered his speech in a whisper so quiet as to be essentially inaudible. He didn't even pretend to be cool about the whole thing, admitting in his speech, for those who could hear it, that no event could have filled him with greater anxieties. It is the definition of irony that unwillingness to be there is probably what made him worthy of the position to begin with. Originally, the presidential inauguration was held in March, but it now happens in January. Either way, it was always expected to be a bit inhospitable weather-wise, but the inauguration of Ulysses S. Grant was exceptional. During Grant's inauguration on March 4, 1873, the recorded temperature was 16 degrees Fahrenheit, but thanks to the wind chill, it likely felt closer to something between -15 and -30 degrees. It was so cold that some cadets standing guard were sent to the hospital with frostbite. And because the inaugural ball took place in an uninsulated structure, guests were literally freezing all evening. Even worse, as part of the celebration, hundreds of canaries had been set up in cages above the ball. It's likely they all froze to death, although some say they died as a result of the gas lamps. Either way, the effect was the same. The temporary wooden building was not only freezing, but also raining dead birds. The feud between second President John Adams and number 3 Thomas Jefferson was so hot that Adams skipped Jefferson's inauguration altogether. It's possible Adams bailed because it was awkward, but according to historical accounts, Adams was said to be awkwardness personified, so maybe he just didn't want to start a street fight.
I feel a great difficulty as to how to act. I am vice president, yes, and in this I am nothing.
The personal and political relationship between Jefferson and Adams was complicated. During the 1796 election, Adams beat Jefferson, but back in those days, the runner-up became vice president regardless of whether they agreed on anything at all. Those two started out as allies when it was about forming a new nation, but when it came to duking it out for the top spot, the campaign was one of the most brutal in American history. Jefferson's people accused Adams of having a, quote, hideous hermaphroditical character. We don't know what that means, but it's probably bad. While Adams' team called Jefferson a mean-spirited, low-lived fellow. You know what that means.
If you elect Thomas Jefferson, here's what you're gonna get. Murder, all the time. Everybody's gonna be murdering each other.
It was the birth of the American political smear campaign.
Oh, by the way, if you were thinking about voting for Jefferson, you shouldn't, because he's dead.
So after serving a single term, Adams hopped a public stagecoach out of Washington before Jefferson's inauguration, and they didn't speak again for 12 years.
Stop gawking. Plain John Adams. Just an ordinary citizen.
Connected to the bitter end, they died on the same day, July 4th, 1826, within hours of one another. It was 50 years to the day after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. To understand the volatility of Andrew Jackson's inauguration, you should first know that it was the second time he'd run against John Quincy Adams. In 1824, Adams and Jackson faced off against each other for the presidency. Jackson won both the popular and electoral votes, but somehow Adams was elected president. The official story is that Adams was chosen because Jackson only received a plurality of the Electoral College vote, so it went to the House. And long story short, this is where the phrase corrupt bargain originated. As you can imagine, Jackson was melancholy about the whole thing, so by the time 1828 rolled around, tension was high. The campaign was basically Adams, the man of the politicians, against Jackson, the man of the people. This time, Jackson won. This set the stage for the inauguration in 1829, a wild, rowdy, open house party at the White House with 20,000 guests. Guests in muddy shoes stood on furniture, dishes were broken, food was dropped everywhere, and servants had to lure people out of the people's house onto the lawn with promises of whiskey. Lots and lots of whiskey. Whiskey, what can't it save? Jackson himself got trapped against a wall and had to be pulled out of the house and spirited off to the National Hotel for his own safety. Number 14, Franklin Pierce, was called the saddest president by the Washington Post, and his inauguration was understandably tragic.
Believe me, I'd rather be you than president any day.
Just before the inauguration, Pierce, his wife, and his son were traveling by train when their train derailed and tumbled down a hill. Several people died, including Pierce's 11-year-old son. This was the third son Pierce had lost. The first died a few days after being born, and the second died at 4 from typhus. Pierce believed that this latest calamity was personal and that God was punishing him in some way. So on Inauguration Day, he refused to swear his oath on the Bible. He used a law book instead. Pierce's wife didn't even attend the inauguration. She also believed their family was cursed. Pierce, for his part, buried himself in alcohol for most of his term, so yeah, scratch that part before about whiskey saving everything. Even longtime politicians can end up with the jitters. During Abraham Lincoln's second inauguration, Vice President Andrew Johnson threw back 3 large tumblers full of medicinal whiskey and was visibly drunk throughout the ceremony.
Mr. Vice President-elect.
Mr. Chief Justice.
According to an 1885 letter to the editor in the Tennessean, when he was inaugurated as vice president on the 4th of March 1865, Johnson had been on one of the most protracted sprees of his life, and was at the time so inebriated as to make himself a spectacle as he attempted incoherently to utter an inaugural address. In his speech, Johnson apparently ranted at the crowd about his own humble origins, but also his triumph over the rebel aristocracy, some of whom were, of course, sitting right there in the audience. The crowd was silent, Lincoln was embarrassed, and one senator merely face-palmed. But eventually Johnson calmed down, took the vice presidential oath, and grabbed the Bible and gave it a big kiss. After that, while he tried to swear in new senators, Johnson botched it, and a Senate clerk took over for him. Wow, just scratch all the whiskey stuff. This is taking a turn. On Inauguration Day, Dwight D. Eisenhower skipped breakfast with Truman, his predecessor. That morning, Mrs. Truman prepared, or had someone prepare, what Truman called a very fine breakfast.
Mr. Eisenhower was supposed to come to that breakfast, which he didn't do.
Eisenhower also refused to greet Truman before the swearing in, and it's kind of understandable. The two had worked together in the past, but campaigns are wars, and this one had been brutal, with Truman supporting Eisenhower's opponent, Adlai Stevenson. Eisenhower was said to have regarded Truman as inept, undignified, and surrounded by political yes-men. Truman didn't appreciate that one bit. Those weren't the only ways in which Eisenhower's inauguration broke from tradition. He presided over a large inaugural parade, eventually being lassoed by a cowboy, with the permission of the Secret Service, of course. Or that could have been extremely awkward, but also perhaps more than a little entertaining. There's probably a reason people don't mix farm animals with presidential inaugurations, but apparently nobody told Richard Nixon. Nixon's second-term inaugural ball was held at the National Museum of History and Technology. That's now the American History Museum, which also featured a farm exhibit. During the ball itself, a rooster escaped the exhibit and proceeded to accost a wealthy socialite. The bird was ultimately wrangled by a museum employee. A photo of the famous chicken that disrupted the ball is still preserved in the Smithsonian Institution archives, and it wasn't the only time Nixon had a run-in with a farm animal. In fact, it wasn't the only time Nixon had a run-in with a farm animal at his inauguration. In 1969, anti-war protesters brought a pig to the National Mall in efforts to inaugurate it. Tickets to the counter-inaugural ball cheekily offered best seats for $2 and worst seats for $35.